"She is merely a dowry to me," the Duke of Ellesmere said, laughing, to the three men laughing with him. "A bill of exchange with a pretty enough signature. I married her purse, gentlemen, not the girl. One does what one must to keep a roof on Ellesmere. I assure you I feel the transaction no more deeply than I should feel the sale of a horse." He did not know, as the words left him, that his wife stood in the open doorway of the conservatory not 8 feet behind his chair, a cut rose still in her gloved hand, come to bring it to him because she had thought, poor fool, that he might like it upon his coat. Miles Ellesmere did not see her. His friends, facing him across the breakfast table, saw the young Duchess go white to the lips, saw the rose slip from her fingers to the marble floor without a sound, saw her turn and withdraw as silently as she had come, and being gentlemen of the world they said nothing at all, and only exchanged a glance among themselves and changed the subject to the hunting, and let the Duke go on believing himself unheard. It was the kindest thing they could think to do, and it was the cruelest, for it left Miles Ellesmere in perfect ignorance of the ruin he had made in the space of a single careless sentence, and gave him no chance to unsay it while unsaying might yet have mattered. He learned of it, in a manner of speaking, that same evening, though he did not understand what he was learning. He had come to expect a particular quality in his wife of 6 weeks. Frances Ellesmere, born Frances Hartley, daughter of Josiah Hartley of the great cotton mills at Harewell, had come to Ellesmere a bride who tried. That was the word he had settled on for her, privately, with a faint aristocratic condescension he was not proud of but did not trouble to correct. She tried. She tried to please him. She watched his face at dinner to see whether the dishes suited him. She asked him shyly about the estate and the county and the long history of his name, and listened as though the answers mattered. She had in the early days brought him small things, a book she thought he would like, a sprig of something from the garden, once a folded paper of his favorite comfits got specially from the town, and had offered them with a hopeful, half-frightened warmth that he had received with courtesy and set aside, because he had married her money and did not intend to pretend, even to himself, that he had married anything else. That evening she brought him nothing. She came down to dinner in gray silk, perfectly composed, and she was civil and she was correct, and she inquired after his day with a smooth pleasantness that asked for nothing and offered nothing, and when he answered she said, "How interesting," in a voice as level and as closed as a shut ledger, and turned the conversation to the menu for the county dinner they were to give on Thursday. There was no watching of his face. There was no shy hopeful warmth. There was a duchess across the table from him, flawless and remote, and it was as though the girl who tried had packed her bags in the course of a single afternoon and gone away, and left in her place a beautiful competent stranger who would run his house impeccably, and never once let him see inside it again. Miles noticed the change. He did not understand it, and being a man much occupied with his own affairs and his own pride, he did not greatly trouble to. If anything, he found it a relief. The shy hopefulness had made him uncomfortable, had reproached him obscurely for the coldness of the bargain he had struck. A wife who asked nothing was easier by far than a wife who hoped. He told himself that Frances had simply found her feet, had settled into her position, had put away the nervousness of a bride and taken up the dignity of a duchess, and that it suited her and suited him, and that this was how a marriage of their kind was meant to go. He did not think then to ask himself why a woman who had glowed for 6 weeks should go gray and cold in the space of an afternoon. He was not, in those days, a man who asked himself difficult questions. Ellesmere had not raised him to be one. He was 37 years old, and he was proud, and he had reason and inheritance enough for the pride, which is the most dangerous kind. The Ellesmere dukedom was among the oldest in the kingdom. There had been a Duke of Ellesmere at Bosworth and another at Blenheim. The long gallery of the great house held 4 centuries of Ellesmere faces, all of them wearing the same high-bridged aristocratic look that Miles saw in his own glass every morning. He had been reared to believe that the name was the highest thing in England short of the crown, and that everything else, money, trade, the grubby getting and spending by which lesser men lived, was so far beneath it as scarcely to signify. The trouble was that his father had believed it too, and had spent 40 years proving it false. The late Duke had held the getting of money to be beneath an Ellsmere and the spending of it to be an Ellsmere's birthright, and had run through the accumulated wealth of centuries with a magnificent, unconcerned mortgaging farm after farm, timber and plate and the London house, borrowing against the entail itself, until he died and left his son a great name, a great house, and a mountain of debt so vast that the estate could not pay the interest on it, let alone the whole. Miles had come to the title to find it hollow, the roof of the west wing failing, the tenants' cottages tumbling, the home farm losing money every quarter, the bankers circling like patient crows. He had faced, at 3 and 30, the prospect of being the Duke of Ellesmere who lost Ellesmere, the last of 4 centuries, the one whose face the gallery would remember with shame. And there had been exactly one way out, and it had worn a merchant's daughter's face. Josiah Hartley had built the largest cotton mills in the North out of nothing, out of his own 2 hands and his own hard head, and had made a fortune that made the Ellesmere fortune of a century past look small, and Josiah Hartley had 1 child, a daughter, and 1 hunger left in life, which was to see that daughter a lady, not merely genteel. A lady, high and titled and unassailable, set so far above the sneers of the county that had never quite received the mill owner that no one would ever again dare to call her, as they had called her father, Trade. When the discreet approaches were made, the bargain wrote itself. The oldest name in England and the newest fortune, an ancient title for a modern purse, the Duke of Ellesmere's 400 years for Josiah Hartley's £400,000. Miles had gone into it clear-eyed and unashamed. He had told himself it was a transaction between grown people, honestly meant on both sides, and that the girl got a coronet out of it and could have no cause to complain. He had not reckoned on the girl. He had expected, he was honest enough later to admit it to himself, a vulgar bride, a loud, overdressed, overjeweled creature of the manufacturing towns, pushing and anxious and impossible, whom he would have to endure and school and hide from his friends. He had braced for it. And instead Josiah Hartley's daughter had come to Ellesmere and been quiet and grave and quick and quietly beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with jewels. She had read more than Miles had. She had a low, pleasant voice with no trace of the towns in it. She had managed, in 6 weeks, to win the wary old servants of Ellesmere in a way that 4 centuries of Ellesmere breeding could not have taught, simply by being just and observant and kind. She was, Miles had been startled to discover, a lady already more truly a lady. Some uncomfortable corner of him had begun to suspect, than the Lady Marguerite Vanes of his own set, who had the blood and the manner and none of the substance. But he had not let himself dwell on the discovery, because to dwell on it was to be reproached by it, and Miles Ellesmere at 7 and 30 preferred the comfort of his contempt to the discomfort of his conscience. And so, when his friends had chaffed him at that breakfast, Ellesmere, wed to the spinning jenny, how do you find the smell of the shop? Does she count the candle ends of an evening? He had answered them in kind, easily, cruelly, to prove that he was untouched, that the merchant's money had bought his name but not his heart, that he was still and would always be an Ellesmere who felt himself superior to his own wife. She is merely a dowry to me, a bill of exchange with a pretty enough signature. He had said it to save his pride before 3 men whose opinion he would not remember in a year. He had not known his wife was in the doorway, and he would spend, though he did not yet dream it, a very long time learning exactly what those 11 words had cost him. The days that followed set into a pattern, and the pattern was a marvel of cold perfection, and Miles Ellesmere lived inside it for the better part of a month before it began, slowly, to trouble him. His wife was flawless. That was the whole of it, and the whole of the trouble. She ran his house better than it had been run in his father's day or his grandfather's. The dinners she gave were spoken of through 3 counties. The county families who had held themselves aloof from the merchant's daughter came, and were charmed and came again, and went home saying that whatever her origins the young Duchess of Ellesmere was a woman of real quality, and that Ellesmere had done better for himself than anyone had expected. She was gracious to his friends, and gentle with his tenants, and correct with his aunt the Dowager Marchioness, who had come prepared to despise her, and stayed to admire. In every visible particular Frances Ellsmere was the finest duchess the county had seen in a generation, and she was so without effort and without a single false note. And Miles found, to his growing and inexplicable discomfort, that being married to a flawless woman who had closed the door of her heart in his face was a great deal harder to bear than he could account for. For the door was closed. He was sure of it now. In all the smooth, pleasant weeks there was not one moment in which his wife let him see anything real. She smiled at him and it did not reach her eyes. She agreed with him and he could not tell what she thought. She was never cold, that was the maddening thing. He could have borne coldness. He could have understood a sulk. She was warm, warm and pleasant and entirely, perfectly unreachable, a lit window with the curtain drawn, and he stood outside it in the dark of his own making without the least idea that he had drawn the curtain himself. It was his aunt who first said the thing aloud. The Dowager Marchioness of Wexley was Miles's late mother's sister, a shrewd, blunt, formidable old woman who had come to Ellsmere for a fortnight and stayed 6 weeks because, as she said, she found the household more interesting than she had bargained for. She sat with Miles in the library one evening after Frances had retired, and she looked at her nephew over her spectacles for a long assessing moment, and she said without preamble, "What did you do to that girl?" Miles looked up from his letters. "I beg your pardon, Aunt." "Your wife," said the Dowager. "What did you do to her? And do not tell me nothing, for I have eyes, and I have watched the pair of you for a month, and I tell you that woman was in love with you when I came, or halfway to it, or wished to be. I know the look, I have worn it myself. God help me, and now she is not, and something turned her, and turnings of that sort do not happen by themselves. A woman does not close over like that for no reason. Someone shut her. Was it you?" She set down her cards. "She is worth 10 of you, Miles, and I say it as your own blood and your mother's sister who loves you. That is not a merchant's daughter who married up. That is a rare woman, and you have got her by an accident of your father's debts that you did nothing to deserve, and you are treating her. I have watched you with a careless, lofty, well-bred contempt that would make your mother weep. What did you do?" And Miles Ellsmere, who did not know what he had done, because he did not know she had heard him, said stiffly, "I have done nothing, Aunt, but be perfectly civil to my wife, who is, as you say, an excellent woman, and who seems to me entirely content." And the Dowager looked at him a long moment with something that was almost pity, and gathered her cards, and said only, "Then God help you, nephew, for you are blind as well as proud, and that is the most expensive thing a man can be," and went up to bed, and left him alone with his letters and the first faint, unwelcome, ineradicable seed of a suspicion that he had lost something he had never troubled to know he possessed. The days after his aunt's warning were, on the surface, the most agreeable of Miles Ellsmere's married life, and that was precisely the horror of them, for he could not put his finger on a single thing that was wrong, and could not for an hour shake the sense that everything was. He began for the first time to watch his wife. He had not truly watched her before. A man does not watch a bill of exchange. But the Dowager's words had lodged in him. Someone shut her. Was it you? And so he found himself, over the following week, observing Frances as a man observes a country he has crossed 100 times without ever once looking up, and discovering, to his slow discomfort, that it was full of things he had never seen. He watched her with the servants. There was a way she had with them, a plain, steady courtesy that asked nothing and noticed everything, and he saw that they had come to love her, not to fear her as they had feared his father, nor to endure her as they had endured his own careless coldness, but to love her in the undemonstrative northern way, so that the surly old butler Hodges, who had not smiled in Miles's memory, unbent to her, and the youngest scullery maid was not afraid of her. And the whole vast machinery of the household had begun to turn with a willingness it had not shown in years. She knew their names. She knew which of them had a sick mother in the village and which a son gone for a soldier, and she asked after the mother and the soldier and remembered the answers. Miles, who did not know the name of his own second footman, watched this and felt, obscurely, reproached. He watched her with the tenants. In the second week a dispute came up to the house, two farmers, the Bracks and the Ostlers, at each other's throats over a boundary ditch and a diverted stream, a quarrel of 40 years standing that had come at last to a broken fence and a threat of law. Such things were the steward's to manage, and Perrott would have managed it as it had always been managed, by finding for the stronger tenant and letting the weaker sulk. But Frances asked, quietly, if she might hear it, and Miles, curious, led her. And he stood at the back of the estate office while his wife heard the two red-faced angry men out, one and then the other without interruption, with a grave, patient attention that visibly disarmed them, and then walked out with them in her good gown, through the January mud to look at the ditch itself. The actual ditch, which no Ellsmere in memory had ever troubled to look at, and stood in the cold and worked out with a few plain questions. That the stream had shifted its bed in a flood 9 years back, and that neither man was in the wrong by the old agreement, both being in the right by different years of it. And she proposed a division that gave each something and cost each a little, and had them dig the new ditch together on the fair line, at the estate's expense for the labor, so that neither could say the other had won. And the two old enemies who had come up ready to ruin one another at law went away grumbling and half-satisfied, and within the month on speaking terms for the first time in a decade. Perrott, watching, had said to Miles under his breath, "11 years I've kept this estate, your grace, and I never once thought to walk out and look at the ditch," and Miles had said nothing, because he had been thinking the same thing about the whole of his life. He watched her at the county calls, where the great families came, stiff with curiosity, to inspect the merchant's daughter, and where Frances received them with a poise that was not the brittle performing poise of a woman anxious to be accepted, but the quiet, unassailable ease of a woman who did not, at bottom, much care whether they accepted her or not, and who was therefore, by the perverse law of such things, accepted at once and completely. She talked to the old dowagers of their rheumatism and their grandchildren and their still-room recipes, and to the young men of the harvest and the hunting, and to the clever, discontented wives of things that mattered, books and the state of the poor and the price of bread. And she sent every one of them home saying that Ellsmere had married a woman of quality, and that they could not think how he had had the sense. And Miles, standing by, would catch some visitor's eye and see in it a frank envy lucky Ellsmere, to have got that, and would feel a hot, strange pride, and then remember that he had called her a horse, and feel something a great deal colder. But it was in the evenings, when the callers were gone and the house was quiet, that the true shape of what he had done was plainest and hardest to bear. For in the evenings there was no audience and no need for the flawless Duchess, and yet the flawless Duchess remained. The mask did not come off when they were alone, as a mask should. If anything, it fixed itself the harder. They dined together, the two of them, at the long table, and she was pleasant and correct and gave him nothing. They sat together an hour in the drawing-room afterward, as a married couple should, and she sewed or read and answered when he spoke and asked him nothing, and told him nothing. And when the clock struck 10 she rose and said, "I will bid you good night, your grace," in her level, closed voice, and went up, and left him alone by the fire with the growing understanding that he was the loneliest married man in England, and that he had made himself so. And that he did not know how it had happened, because he had not been paying attention when it happened, which was the whole of the trouble and had always been. One night that week he could not sleep, and came down again near midnight for a book, and found the drawing-room dark and the fire sunk to embers, and paused in the doorway, and saw, for she had not heard him, that his wife had come down too, alone, and was standing at the tall window in her wrapper with a candle guttering beside her, looking out at the black winter garden, and that her face, unwatched, unmasked, was the saddest thing he had ever seen. Not weeping, past weeping. Only sad, deeply and quietly sad. The sadness of a person who has made her peace with a disappointment, and finds the peace costs more, in the small hours, than the fight would have. And Miles stood in the dark doorway and looked at his wife's unguarded sorrow, and understood, with a lurch, that he was looking at his own handiwork, that this was the girl who tried, grieving in secret for a thing she had given up hoping for. And he opened his mouth to speak to her, to say something, anything, to cross the room, and then did not, because he did not know what he had done, only that he had done something, and a man who does not know his crime cannot beg pardon for it. and he was too proud still to beg pardon blindly. So he drew back silent into the dark and let her grieve alone, and went up to his own cold bed no wiser and a great deal more troubled, and lay awake till dawn. He told himself in the days that followed a number of comfortable things. He told himself that all marriages of their kind settled into such an arrangement, a civil partnership of separate lives, and that it was foolish to expect more, and that he had married for money and got money and had no right to complain that he had not also got love, which had never been part of the bargain. He told himself that Frances was content, that her sadness at the window had been a passing mood, a touch of homesickness, nothing. He told himself that his aunt was a romantic old woman who saw broken hearts where there were only settled arrangements. He told himself all of this, industriously, for the better part of a week, and did not believe a word of it, because he had seen her face at the window, and a man cannot unsee a thing like that, however diligently he lies to himself about it. And underneath all the comfortable lies, unwatered but stubbornly alive, the seed his aunt had planted went on growing in the dark. The small, cold, ineradicable suspicion that his flawless, remote, unreachable wife had once, not long ago, been reachable, that something had shut the door of her, and that if he only knew what it was, he might perhaps find the door again. He did not yet connect it to a certain breakfast, a certain sentence, a certain rose he had never known was cut. He was not looking in that direction. A man does not suspect his own careless cruelty, having long since forgotten it. But the suspicion turned him, that week, from a husband who did not watch his wife into one who watched her constantly, hungrily, with a new and growing and entirely unwelcome attention. And it was because he had at last begun to watch her that the matter of the home farm accounts, when it came, struck him as it did, and changed everything. For a man who has begun to watch is a man ready at last to see. The seed of the suspicion might have died in the dark, unwatered, had it not been for the matter of the home farm accounts, which came to Miles's notice a week later and changed, though he did not know it yet, the entire course of his understanding. He had gone into the estate office to sign the quarter's papers, a chore he loathed and did badly, and he had found the steward, old Perrott, laying out the books with an air of suppressed excitement that sat oddly on a man who for 3 years had brought Miles nothing but bad news. "You will want to see this, your grace," Perrott said, and turned the great ledger round. "The home farm. This quarter it has turned a profit, a small one, but a profit, your grace, the first in 11 years. Miles looked at the figures without understanding them, as he looked at all figures. "How?" he said. Perrott hesitated. "Her grace, sir," he said at last. "The Duchess. I hope I have not overstepped, your grace, but she came to the office some weeks past and asked to see the books, and I did not like to refuse her, and she, your grace, she read them the way a scholar reads Greek. She saw in an afternoon what I had not seen in 11 years. The dairy was being run at a loss because we sold the milk raw to the town at the town's price. She has had us make it up into cheese, the hard cheese that keeps, and sell it in the winter markets at 4 times the sum. The wet meadow that flooded every spring and drowned the hay, she had it drained into the mill race, a thing her father does at Harewell, she said, and now it carries 3 cuttings. The waste, your grace, she found waste in every corner, small leaks, a shilling here and a shilling there, and she has stopped them all gently without turning off a single man, and it comes to this." He tapped the black figure at the foot of the page. "A profit, and it is only the beginning," she says. "She has plans for the whole estate, if you will permit it. She did not wish me to trouble you until she was sure. She said, forgive me, your grace. She said you had married her fortune, and it was only right her fortune should not be needed to prop the place, that she would rather mend it than merely pay for it, and that she would sooner earn her keep than be a bill that Ellsmere must honor forever." The phrase went into Miles like a splinter. A bill that Ellsmere must honor forever. He heard behind it the echo of his own voice, a bill of exchange with a pretty enough signature, and for the first time a cold suspicion moved in him that his wife's words were not chance. "She said that," he said slowly. "Those words, a bill." "Something very like, your grace." Miles stood a long moment looking at the black figure his wife had made where for 11 years there had been only red. And a strange thing happened to his pride. It did not know where to stand. For here was the merchant's daughter, the dowry, the pretty signature, quietly, without a word to him, without asking a shred of credit, saving the thing he had married her to save, and saving it not with the vulgar money he had held in such contempt, but with a mind, a swift and disciplined and formidable mind, of a kind that no Ellsmere in 4 centuries had ever possessed. His father had been born to the oldest name in England and had beggared it in 40 years. This girl had been born over a mill and was mending in a single quarter what 4 generations of dukes had let rot. And Miles Ellsmere, standing in his estate office with the proof of it under his hand, felt the ground of his whole comfortable contempt shift and settle beneath him, and did not like the feeling, and could not make it stop. He sought her out that evening. He hardly knew what he meant to say. He found her in the small morning room she had made her own, at a desk covered in papers surveys. He saw maps of the estate, a book of agricultural improvement with a dozen slips of paper marking the pages, working by candlelight with a pen in her hand and a smudge of ink on her finger. And for a moment, before she knew he was there, he saw her as she truly was when the drawing-room mask was off. Absorbed, keen, alive, the shy girl and the flawless duchess both gone and in their place, a woman of powerful intelligence bent happily to a difficult problem. And she was so much more than either of the things he had allowed her to be in his mind that he stood in the doorway oddly robbed of breath. Then she looked up and saw him, and the mask came down smooth, pleasant, remote, and the alive woman vanished as though she had never been. "Your Grace," she said, rising. "Did you want me? I am sorry I did not hear you. I was at the drainage plans for the North Farms. They are dull, I am afraid. Shall I ring for anything?" "Perrott showed me the accounts," Miles said. "The home farm, the profit, Francis, that was your doing, all of it, he told me." "It was a small thing," she said. "The place was leaking money in 100 small ways, that is all. My father would call it housekeeping. I have kept house all my life. It is the one thing I was truly taught. I hope I did not overstep. I should have asked your leave. I will not touch the books again if you would rather I did not." "Do not be absurd," Miles said. "You have done in a quarter what I could not do in 3 years. I came to," and here he found to his own surprise that the word he wanted was one he was not much practiced in, "I came to thank you. And to say that I did not know, that you had such a turn for it. I did not know you at all, I begin to think." And Frances Ellsmere looked at him across the candlelight, and her face did not change, and she said, in her level, pleasant, closed voice, "No, I do not think you did, your Grace, but it is of no consequence. A dowry need not be known, after all. It need only be banked." And she smiled at him, a perfect, gracious smile that did not reach her eyes, and returned to her drainage plans. And Miles Ellsmere stood in the doorway of his wife's morning room and understood, at last and all at once, with a lurch of the heart he would not have believed himself capable of, exactly what she had heard, and exactly what he had done, and exactly what it had cost him. She had heard, of course she had heard. A bill of exchange with a pretty enough signature. A dowry need only be banked. She had thrown his own words back at him with a smile, and she had been throwing them back at him, he now saw, for weeks, in a dozen quiet ways he had been too proud and too blind to catch, earn her keep. A bill Ellsmere must honor, and he had blundered past every one of them. The girl who tried had not found her feet and put away her nerves. The girl who tried had stood in a doorway with a rose in her hand, meaning to bring it to his coat, and had heard her husband tell 3 laughing men that she was a horse he had sold himself to, and had picked up the pieces of herself off the marble floor and put them somewhere he could never reach them again. And she had gone on, flawless, gracious, saving his estate with her own 2 hands, and had let him think himself unheard because he understood this too now, and it was the worst of it, because she had too much pride to let him see the wound. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would be the finest duchess in England, and she would owe him nothing, not even her tears. Miles went out of the morning room without another word, because there were no words, and he walked the long, cold gallery of his ancestors half the night, under the 4 centuries of high-bridged Ellsmere faces, and for the first time in his life the pride they had bred into him gave him no comfort at all. He resolved to make it right. He was, whatever his faults, not a coward, and once he had seen the thing clearly he did not flinch from it. He would apologize. He would tell her he had been a proud fool, that he had spoken to save face before men whose good opinion was worth nothing, that he had not meant it, that he had come to see her worth. And he began, the very next morning, to try, and discovered, over the following weeks, the particular and exquisite difficulty of trying to win a woman who has decided, with perfect justice and perfect resolve, never to be a fool for you twice. For Frances would not be won. She received his new attentions exactly as in the early days he had received hers, with flawless courtesy and no warmth and a gentle deflecting grace that gave him nothing to take hold of. When he praised her, she thanked him pleasantly and changed the subject. When he sought her company, she gave it correctly and withheld herself entirely. When once awkwardly he tried to speak of the thing directly, "Frances, I fear I gave you, early in our marriage, a false impression of my regard." She had looked at him with a calm that was worse than any anger and said, "You gave me no false impression at all, your grace. You were perfectly honest. I have always valued honesty above almost everything. Pray do not trouble to revise it now on my account. I assure you I am quite content with the truth as it stands." And she had turned the conversation to the county dinner, and left him with the maddening, humbling understanding that she had every card and knew it, and that he had dealt her the whole hand himself. It was into this delicate deadlock that Lady Marguerite Vane arrived, in the 3rd week of October, trailing malice and expensive scent, to make everything a great deal worse. Lady Marguerite Vane was the daughter of an earl and the widow of a viscount, and she had, for the better part of a decade, considered Miles Ellsmere her own particular property, to be claimed at her leisure whenever she should tire of being a fashionable widow. That the leisure had stretched a little long, and that Ellsmere had gone and married a millowner's daughter while she dawdled, she regarded not as a defeat but as an inconvenience, a vulgar interruption that a woman of her address could surely repair. She came to Ellsmere for the great October house party that Frances had arranged, and she came radiant, and she came dangerous, and she took one look at the young Duchess presiding gracefully over the crowded drawing-room and understood two things at once: that the merchant's daughter was 100 times more formidable than the county gossips had led her to hope, and that there was, running beneath the flawless surface of the Ellsmere marriage, a coldness she might turn to her own account. She set to work the first evening. Her method was old and effective and hard to answer, for it was all done in the language of compliments. "My dear Duchess," she said, over the card table in a carrying voice, "I do so admire what you have done with the old place. It has quite a new look, so practical. One sees the modern touch everywhere. I dare say at Harewell you learned all manner of clever economies that we poor idle creatures never dreamed of. Tell me, is it true you keep the household accounts yourself, with your own hand? How wonderfully industrious! We should none of us know where to begin. It must be quite like keeping the books of the mill." She smiled sweetly all round the table. One does so respect a woman who is useful. It was beautifully aimed. It named Frances's origins, her trade, her hands in the ledger's usefulness, and made every one of them, in the mouth of an earl's daughter, a small precise humiliation dressed as praise, and it invited the whole table to remember, with a titter, that the Duchess of Ellesmere had been bought over a counter. Miles, watching from across the room, felt the old careless world he had been bred to close ranks in the smile that went round the table, and felt, for the first time in his life, on which side of it he stood, and it was not the side he had been born on. Frances did not flinch. She laid down a card and said pleasantly, "You are very kind, Lady Marguerite. Yes, I keep the accounts. My father taught me. He began with nothing, you know, a boy of 11 sweeping a mill floor for a shilling a week, and he built the largest concern in the north, and he did it by understanding to a farthing where every penny came from and where every penny went, and he taught me the same, and I have never been ashamed of it." She met the older woman's eyes across the table with a calm that did not waver. "I have found it a great advantage. This estate was very near ruin when I came to it, through no industry at all but a great deal of idleness, and it is being mended now, and it is being mended by exactly the sort of practical usefulness you are so good as to admire. I would rather be a woman who is useful, Lady Marguerite, than a woman who is merely ornamental. But then I dare say we are each of us formed by our upbringing, and cannot help it, and must make the best of what we were given. And she smiled sweetly and played her card and won the trick, and the whole table understood that the merchant's daughter had just with perfect courtesy cut the earl's daughter to the bone, and Miles Ellsmere, watching his wife, felt a swell of something in his chest so sharp and so unexpected that it took him a moment to name it, and when he named it, it was pride. Pride in her, the first entirely admirable pride he had ever felt in his life, and it was for a woman he had called a bill of exchange. Lady Marguerite did not forgive the card table, but she was clever, cleverer than Francis gave her credit for, and she saw that a frontal assault on the Duchess would not answer, and she changed her ground. She would not attack the wife. She would work upon the husband. And she began, with the patience of a huntress, to remind Miles Ellsmere of the world he had been born to and had, in his folly, half forgotten. She was always at his elbow now. She talked to him of the old days, the old set, the old easy, brilliant, careless world of blood and breeding, where a man of his name belonged and need never think about drainage or cheese or the price of milk. She flattered his lineage. She deplored delicately the necessity that had driven so great a name to so low a match. She let him understand, without ever saying it, that she thought him wasted, that a duke of 4 centuries buried in the country doing sums with a mill-owner's daughter was a kind of tragedy, and that there was still, for a man bold enough to reach for it, a finer life to be had among his own kind. "One does what one must, of course," she murmured to him one evening on the terrace, "to save an estate. No one blames you, Miles, it was the sensible thing, but sense is a cold bedfellow, is it not? A man of your quality was not made for a life of sense. You were made for," and she let it hang and looked at him, and the meaning was as plain as a spoken word. And here was the crux of Miles Ellsmere, and here the story might have gone either way, for the truth was that 6 months before he would have found Lady Marguerite's murmurs the most natural music in the world, the confirming voice of everything Ellsmere had bred into him, the reassurance that his contempt was correct, and his match beneath him and his true home among the brilliant idle blood he had been born to. 6 months before, he would have half believed her. But he had seen the black figure in the ledger where 4 generations had left only red. He had seen his wife's ink-stained finger, and her keen, absorbed face bent over the drainage plans by candlelight. He had seen her cut Lady Marguerite to the bone with more true breeding in one courteous sentence than the earl's daughter owned in her whole pedigree. And so, on the terrace, when Lady Marguerite let her meaning hang in the air between them like a held-out hand, Miles Ellsmere heard it and understood it, and felt instead of the old easy answering warmth a cold recoil, a clarity, almost a disgust. And he said quietly, "You mistake me, Marguerite. And you mistake my wife, which is the graver error, for she is worth a dozen of the life you are describing, and I am only now beginning to understand how badly I have used her, and I do not intend to compound the folly by listening to you." And he had bowed and gone in, and left Lady Marguerite alone on the terrace with a face that, had he seen it, would have warned him that he had just made an enemy who would not be satisfied with murmurs. He did not see it. He went in, that night, lighter than he had felt in weeks, resolved anew to win his wife, certain now of the thing he wanted and only ignorant, still, of how very hard it would be to get. For it is one thing to know your own heart. It is another to persuade a woman you have publicly called a horse to believe you have found it. He tried a new way in the days that followed. He stopped courting Frances with words which she deflected, and began to court her with the one currency she could not wave aside, which was the estate, her estate now, in every way that mattered, the thing she had poured herself into. He came to the office and asked her, humbly, to teach him the books. He rode out with her to the North Farms to see the drainage. He listened, actually listened, to her plans for the whole reach of the Ellsmere lands, a new market road, a scheme to bring the small tenants together to buy seed and stock in common as her father's mill hands bought their coal, 100 practical patient improvements that would take 10 years, and remake the estate from the ground up. And he found, riding beside her through his own cold country with the autumn coming down off the hills, that he was happier in her grave, clever company, talking of turnips and tenants, than he had ever been in a London ballroom in his life, and he began slowly to see the thaw he longed for. She unbent by degrees over the work. She forgot sometimes to hold the mask up. Once at the top of the North Ridge, explaining her Marketrode scheme with her cheeks bright from the wind, she caught herself laughing at some dry thing he said, really laughing before she remembered and stopped, and the mask came down, but he had seen it. The true Frances, the girl who tried grown into a woman who might someday try again, and he held on to the memory of that unguarded laugh as a drowning man holds a spar. It was in the middle of this fragile thaw that Josiah Hartley came to Ellsmere, and the county learned, and Lady Marguerite laid her plans, and the fragile thing very nearly broke. Josiah Hartley arrived unannounced on a wet Thursday in an old-fashioned coach, a broad, plain, blunt old man in good sober cloth with a face weathered by 60 years of hard weather and hard work, and he embraced his daughter in the great marble hall with a fierce open tenderness that made the footmen stare, and he shook the Duke's hand with a grip like a smith's, and he looked Miles up and down with a pair of shrewd gray eyes that missed nothing, and he said, blunt as a hammer, "So, you're the Duke my Fanny married. I'll tell you plain, your grace, I didn't come for the coronet. My girl wanted a title and I bought her one, same as I'd buy her a horse if she wanted a horse, because there's nothing in this world I wouldn't buy her if it was for sale and it made her happy. But happiness isn't for sale, your grace, and I've come to see with my own eyes whether she's got any, because her letters these 2 months have been that cheerful and that careful I stopped believing a word of them. A father knows, so that's why I'm here. And I'll thank you not to fob me off with a fine dinner and a tour of your pictures, for I've no interest in your pictures. I've an interest in my girl." And Miles Ellsmere, standing in his own hall under the eyes of his own servants, looked at the blunt old man who had built a fortune from a mill floor and loved his daughter enough to cross half of England on the strength of a too cheerful letter, and felt his 4 centuries of pride, for the second time in a month, find nowhere to stand, and heard himself say, "Lo, you are welcome to Ellsmere, sir, and you are right to have come. I have not made your daughter happy. I have made her the reverse, through a folly I am trying and so far failing to mend. I will not fob you off. Stay as long as you like and watch as closely as you please, and if at the end of it you think she would be happier under your roof than mine, I will not—" the words cost him more than he had ever paid for anything. "I will not stand in her way." And Josiah Hartley looked at him a long, long moment with those shrewd gray eyes, and something in the old man's blunt face shifted, and he said slowly, "Well, that's honester than I looked for. We'll see, your grace, we'll see." And Frances, standing between the 2 men who had bought and married and bewildered her, looked from her father to her husband with an expression Miles could not read at all, and for the first time in many weeks, the flawless mask was nowhere on her face. Josiah Hartley stayed at Ellsmere, and he watched, exactly as he had promised, and Miles found the old man's watching a harder thing to bear than any sneer the county could have offered, because there was nothing in it he could resent, only a father's shrewd, patient attention, missing nothing, saying little, weighing everything. The old man rose early, as men who have swept mill floors rise early all their lives, and he took to walking the estate in the raw January mornings before the house was properly awake, and on the second morning Miles, restless himself, joined him, and they walked the frozen home farm together in the gray light, the Duke of 4 centuries and the millowner of 1 lifetime, and Josiah Hartley looked at everything with his shrewd gray eyes and asked short, blunt questions and drew, Miles could see, his own conclusions. "That's a well-run dairy," the old man said, stopping at the byre where the new cheese room stood clean and busy. "Somebody's thought about it. Somebody's costed it. Milk sold raw at the town's price loses money 9 months of the year. Anybody in trade knows it. How many gentlemen's dairies still do it, I couldn't tell you, for gentlemen don't cost things, it's beneath them. Whose notion was the cheese?" "My wife's," Miles said. "I," said Josiah, unsurprised. "And the drained meadow yonder, that's carrying winter feed where there ought to be a bog." "Hers." and the new fences on the far side, and the tenant's seed bought in common, that Perrott was telling me of. Hers, all of it hers. Miles looked out over the estate his wife was quietly remaking. She has done in a season, Mr. Hartley, what my family failed to do in a century. I confess, I did not expect it of her. I did not know she had such gifts. I did not, I am ashamed to say, trouble to find out. Josiah Hartley was silent a moment, looking not at the estate now but at his son-in-law. "No," he said at last slowly. "I don't suppose you did. It's the way of it with your sort. You look at a lass like my Fanny and you see a portion, a face, a name to hang on your arm. You don't see the head on her shoulders because it's never occurred to you a woman's head might be worth the seeing. I'll tell you a thing about my daughter, your Grace, since you've owned you never troubled to learn it. When she was a girl of 12, I found her one night at my own account books that I'd left out, checking my figures, checking them, mind, and she'd found a slip my chief clerk had made, a matter of £40 that grown men paid to know better had missed. 12-year-old. I could have sent her to bed and thought no more of it, the way most fathers would, for what's a girl to do with figures? But I didn't. I sat her down and I taught her the whole of it, everything I knew, the mill from the cotton bale to the ledger, because I'd rather have a clever child than a fashionable one, and because I'd no son, and because it seemed to me a wicked waste of a good head to leave it idle for the sake of a notion about what girls are. And she took to it like a duck to water, and she's the equal of any man of business I know, my Fanny, and a better manager than her own father, and I've never been prouder of anything I made in my life, mills and all." He turned his shrewd gray gaze full on Miles. "And you called her a bill of exchange?" "Oh, I've heard of it. Servants talk and a father hears things." "You called that girl, that head, that heart, a bill of exchange with a pretty signature before 3 fools at a breakfast, and she standing in the door with a rose in her hand." His voice did not rise, it did not need to. "I'd have called a man out for less in my young days, your Grace, Duke or no Duke. But I'm an old man now, and it's not my quarrel to fight, it's hers, and she'd not thank me for fighting it. So I'll only say this to you once, and then I'll hold my peace and watch. You've been given a pearl, and you took it for a bead, and you said so out loud, and it's cost you dear, and it'll cost you dearer yet before you're done, and I'll not lift a finger to spare you a farthing of the reckoning, for you've earned every penny of it. But—" he paused. "If you should ever come to see what you've got, truly see it, not just find it useful, but see it, then you'll have in that girl the finest thing that'll ever come into your grand old cold house, and you'll be a richer man than all your 400 year of dukes put together, for they none of them had a Fanny. That's all. Mind the ice there, it's treacherous." And he walked on, blunt and unhurried, leaving Miles standing on the frozen path with his 4 centuries about him like a cloak that had suddenly grown too heavy to wear. The old man was tender with his daughter in a way that Miles, watching, found almost unbearable to see, because it showed him by contrast the exact measure of his own coldness. Josiah Hartley did not stand on ceremony with Frances. He called her Fanny and lass and my girl before the servants, and did not care who heard. He took her hand at dinner and held it a moment for no reason but that he was glad to be near her. He listened to her talk of drainage and cheese and tenants with a beaming pride that he made no effort to hide, and argued figures with her happily across the table, the two of them lost in a language of profit and loss that shut the whole grand company out. And Frances, in her father's presence, was more nearly herself, warm, quick, laughing, the mask half down, than Miles had seen her since the morning of the rose. It was as though the old man had brought a window with him, and opened it in the shut house of her, and Miles saw through it, for whole minutes at a time, the woman he might have had and had thrown away, and the seeing was a torment and a hope at once. He sought the old man out again, the night before the great dinner, of his own accord in the library. He hardly knew what he wanted, some counsel perhaps, or only to be near the one person in the house who loved Frances plainly and knew what she was. Josiah heard his awkward approach with a dry patience, and at length set down his book and said, "You're wanting to know how to mend it. I can see it working in you. Well, I'll not tell you, for I don't know, and if I did it wouldn't serve. For a thing like this a man must find his own way to, or it's worth nothing. But I'll tell you what won't mend it, since you're bound to try them all first, being your sort. Presents won't mend it. She's had a rich man's presents and knows they cost nothing. Fine words won't mend it. She's clever, and she'll hear the calculation under any words you find, for you gave her cause to. And doing her honor before company won't quite mend it, though it'll help, for she'll wonder if you do it with the company not watching. He leaned forward, and his blunt, weathered face was, for a moment, almost kind. I built a fortune from nothing, your grace, and I'll tell you the one thing I learned that's worth all the rest. Folk believe what costs the teller. Cheap words, cheap deeds they discount, same as they'd discount a note from a man they know to be broke. But let a man pay dear for a thing, let it cost him what he can least afford to lose, and even his enemies believe him then, for no man pays dear for a lie. If ever you want my daughter to believe you love her and not her uses, you'll have to pay for the saying of it in the one coin she knows you value above her. And I think you know in your heart what coin that is, and I think the knowing of it frightens you, as well it might. But there's no other road. I've looked. There's no other road at all. And he took up his book again and would say no more, and Miles went out into the cold gallery of his ancestors and stood a long time under the 4 centuries of Ellsmere faces, and understood, dimly and with dread, exactly what the old man meant and how much it would cost, and that he was not yet, not quite yet, brave enough to pay it. The county, meanwhile, had learned that the merchant himself was at Ellsmere, and the county's curiosity curdled, as Miles had known it would, into a low, malicious anticipation. Old Josiah Hartley of the Harewell Mills, dining at Ellsmere among the oldest blood of 3 shires. It was too rich a spectacle to miss, and the invitations Francis had sent for the great dinner were accepted to the last, by families who would not ordinarily have crossed the county for an Ellsmere dinner, purely for the pleasure of watching the mill owner be out of his depth. Miles understood their coming for what it was. Lady Marguerite, he did not doubt, understood it better, and had helped it along, and meant to make of the dinner a public humiliation that would remind Francis, before the whole world, of exactly how low she and her father truly stood in the only society that counted. And Miles Ellsmere, on the morning of the dinner, found himself standing at a crossroads he had not chosen and could not avoid. He could let it happen, could sit at the head of his table, and let the county do its cruel work on the blunt old man who had built something out of nothing, and loved his daughter better than Miles had ever loved anything, and keep his own place safe among his own kind. Or he could do the other thing, the thing his aunt had hinted at and Josiah had named, the thing that would cost him stand up before the whole assembled world he had been bred to, and take his place, openly and at a price, beside the mill and the merchant's daughter, and let his own set see exactly where his loyalty lay. He did not decide it in advance. He did not, that morning, know which he would do. But he dressed for dinner with old Josiah's words going round and round in his head. Folk believe what costs the teller. And he went down to his own table not knowing, until the moment came and Lady Marguerite opened her sweet, cruel mouth over the soup, which man he was going to be. The dinner was Lady Marguerite's doing, though she arranged it so cleverly that it looked like Francis's, and its purpose was to put Josiah Hartley on display before the county, and let the county do what the county could be trusted to do, which was to sneer. It very nearly succeeded. The great table was filled with the oldest families of 3 shires, and Lady Marguerite had seen to the placing, and she had set the blunt old mill owner among the haughtiest of them, and she had opened over the soup with a smile. "Mr. Hartley, you must tell us all about the mills. We are so curious. We hear such things about the manufacturing towns, the noise, the smoke, the crowds of little hands at the machines. It must be a very different world from ours. Quite another England. Do the people there live very much as we do, or is it all quite otherwise?" And a soft titter went round the table, and every polished face turned to the old man in his good sober cloth, waiting for him to be crude or defensive or ashamed, so that they might go home and say that the Duchess's father had been exactly what one would expect. And Josiah Hartley set down his spoon unhurried and looked round the shining table with his shrewd gray eyes, and said, in his plain, blunt northern voice, "It's quite otherwise, my lady, and I'll tell you the chief of the difference, since you ask so kindly. In my England, a man is worth what he makes. Not what his great-grandfather made, what he makes himself with his own head and his own hands in his own life. I began sweeping a mill floor at 11-year-old for a shilling a week, and I built the largest spinning concern north of the Trent, and I employ 4,000 souls, and I feed their families, and I schooled their children before the law ever thought of it, and I did it all myself, and I'm not ashamed to say so at any table in the land. That's my England. He took a slow sip of his wine. I'm told there's another England where a man may be born to everything and do nothing his whole life long and think himself the finer for it. I've met a deal of that England since I came south. I'll not say which of the two Englands does the more useful work, my lady, for I'm a guest at this good table, and it wouldn't be mannerly. But I know which one built the coat on your back and the cotton on this cloth and half the fortunes in this room that pretend they never touched trade. And I know which one my daughter came out of, and I'm prouder of her than of every acre and every picture in this fine old house, and I'd say the same at Windsor to the king. There was a silence you could have cut, and Lady Marguerite, who had overreached, opened her mouth to repair it, and Miles Ellsmere spoke first. He rose at the head of his own table, glass in hand, and every eye turned to him, and he said, in the cool, high-carrying voice of 4 centuries of Ellsmere's, "My father-in-law is entirely right, and I am ashamed it has taken me so long to see it, and I will say so plainly at my own table where I have too long allowed a great deal of idle nonsense to be talked. This house was very near lost, my friends, the whole of it, 4 centuries gone through exactly the sort of well-bred uselessness that some of you were smiling at just now, the uselessness of my own family, who were too proud to work and too grand to count, and beggared the oldest name in England in their idleness. It was saved, it is being saved, this very quarter. For the first time in 11 years it turned a profit, by the mind and the industry and the practical courage of Josiah Hartley's daughter, my wife, who was bred to be useful and is not ashamed of it, and who is worth, I tell you frankly, every soul at this table put together, myself the foremost. I will hear no more sneering at trade under this roof. The trade paid for the roof. And I will drink, if you please, to my father-in-law, who built something out of nothing, which is more than any man of my blood has done in living memory, to Josiah Hartley, and to my wife." And he drank, alone, at the head of his silenced table, staking the whole of his Ellesmere pride on a merchant and a millowner's daughter before the assembled aristocracy of 3 counties. And after a frozen moment old Josiah Hartley rose, blinking, and lifted his own glass to his son-in-law with a slow, astonished respect. And one by one, shamed, the county followed, until the whole table was drinking to the millowner, all but Lady Marguerite Vane, whose glass stayed on the cloth, and who understood that she had been beaten again, and more publicly this time, and who resolved in the cold quiet of her defeat that if she could not have Miles Ellsmere she would at least make certain the millowner's daughter did not keep him. But Frances, at the foot of the table, watched her husband stand up before the whole world he had been bred to and lay his pride at her father's feet and hers. And for the first time since the morning of the rose and the conservatory, the mask did not merely slip. It fell and did not come back up all evening, and she looked at Miles down the length of the candlelight with something in her grave, clear eyes that he had not seen there since the earliest days, before he broke it, something unguarded, something that might, with care, with time, become again the thing he had thrown away. And Miles Ellsmere, meeting her eyes, felt his heart turn over, and dared at last to hope. The thaw after that night ran fast, as a northern thaw runs once the frost breaks, and it was a crisis in the end that carried it the last of the way, as crises will. The scarlet fever came to the Ellesmere villages in the 2nd week of November, striking first at the low cottages by the river and spreading fast through the crowded winter households, and within days there were sick in a dozen homes and the parish doctor overwhelmed, and the old dread word passing from mouth to mouth. And Frances Ellesmere, who might with perfect propriety have withdrawn to the safety of the great house, and sent money and blankets from a distance as a duchess was expected to do, did nothing of the kind. She had seen fever in the mill towns, she knew what to do, and she did it. She turned the estate schoolroom into a place of nursing. She organized the sound women of the villages into shifts. She had the kitchens of Ellsmere cooking broth by the cauldron and carried it herself, day after day, into the sick cottages, sitting up with the worst of them through the fevered nights with her sleeves rolled and her fine gowns left in the wardrobe, doing the plain, hard, frightening work of keeping the desperately ill alive. And Miles worked beside her. He had never in his life done anything of the kind. Ellsmere's did not carry broth. Ellsmere's did not sit up in laborers' cottages, and he did it now because she did it, and then, after the first day, because he could not have borne not to, because there was a rightness in it, a use, that his whole idle, titled life had never given him. He carried the heavy cauldrons she could not lift. He rode through the November nights for the doctor and for medicines. He sat once through a whole black night in a two-room cottage holding a lantern while his wife fought for the life of a laborer's small daughter, a child of perhaps 6 burning with the fever, and toward dawn the fever broke and the child slept and would live, and Francis, gray with exhaustion, had wept a little then silently from sheer relief, and Miles had put his arm around her in the cold cottage and she had let him, had leaned into him, had rested her worn head against his shoulder for one long unguarded moment while the rescued child slept, and the dawn came up gray and cold at the little window. And Miles Ellsmere had sat there with his wife in his arm and a laborer's child alive across the room, and had thought, with a clarity that shook him, that he had spent 37 years in the wrong life, and had found the right one at last in the last place his pride would ever have looked, and that if he could only hold onto her, he would never ask for anything else as long as he lived. The fever passed, as fevers do. The villages recovered. There had been deaths, but fewer, far fewer, than there would have been without her, and the whole estate knew it, and the name of the young Duchess was spoken in the Ellsmere cottages that winter, and for many winters after, with a love that no Ellsmere before her had earned. And between Miles and Francis there had grown, through those hard weeks of shared work and shared fear and shared small victories, a thing so nearly whole, so nearly the thing he longed for, that Miles began to believe the wound was healing, that the careless sentence was forgiven if not forgotten, that they were coming, slowly and truly, to a real marriage at last. He was wrong, but not in the way he feared. The wound was healing. What he had failed to reckon with was Lady Marguerite Vane, who had watched the thaw with a huntress's patience and a rival's fury, and who understood, far better than Miles did, exactly where the old wound lay and exactly how to tear it open again, and who had found, in the very fact of the healing, the perfect poison. For the surest way to destroy a fragile new-grown trust is not to attack it from outside, but to make the trusting one doubt the motive of the one she has begun, against her better judgment, to trust again. She made her move in December, and she made it, characteristically, so that the knife appeared to be in someone else's hand. The first weeks of December were the happiest Miles Ellsmere had ever known, and he did not know, going through them, that they were the last of their kind, or that they were being watched by an enemy who was already measuring, with a jeweler's patience, exactly where to strike. The thaw held and deepened. The shared work of the estate had become, without either of them quite naming it, a shared life, and Francis, who had built so high a wall against him, found that a wall built against words is no wall at all against a man who has stopped using words and started using deeds. They rode out together in the short, bright December mornings to see the new drains carry off the winter rains where for a century they had flooded. They sat over the great ledgers in the estate office, heads bent close in the lamplight, and Miles learned, clumsily at first and then with a real and growing pleasure, to read the figures his wife had made, to understand at last the language of the thing that had saved his house, and to take, humbly, her instruction. She was a patient teacher and a merciless one. She did not spare his pride the smallest of his errors, and he found, to his own astonishment, that he did not want her to, that there was a cleaner air in being corrected honestly by a woman who did not flatter him than in all the deference of his former life. "You have added that column wrong," she would say, and you have added it wrong because you are hurrying, and you are hurrying because you think figures beneath you. And until you stop thinking figures beneath you, your grace, you will add every column wrong to the end of your days. And Miles, who 6 months before would have frozen any soul alive who spoke so to him, laughed and added it again correctly and was happy. There came an evening he would keep all his life. It was snowing softly, the first real snow of the winter, and they had worked late over the plans for the spring. And when the work was done, Frances had gone to the window to watch the flakes come down gold through the lamplight into the dark garden. And Miles had come and stood beside her, not touching her, only near, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and the silence was not the closed, cold silence of their worst weeks, but something else, something almost easy, almost warm. And Frances had said quietly, not looking at him, "My mother used to say that snow was the sky forgiving the earth, covering over all the mud and the bare places, making everything clean again for a while, so you could begin the winter with a fresh face on the world." She had been silent a moment. "She died when I was 15. She was the one who taught me the things my father could not, that a person is not a sum, that the worth of a thing is not its price. My father knows the price of everything. He built a fortune on it, but it was my mother who knew the worth. I have tried to be both. It is not an easy thing to be both." And Miles had looked at his wife's face in the gold light of the falling snow, and had understood that she had just told him something true and private, unguarded, offered the first such thing she had offered him since the morning of the rose. And he had understood, too, with a wisdom he had not known he possessed, that this was not the moment to seize upon it, to make his declaration, to press his advantage. That a wall which is coming down of its own slow accord must not be pushed, or it will go back up higher than before. So he had said only, gently, "Your mother sounds a wise woman. I think she would be very proud of her daughter, who is both. I think she would be prouder of you than of any fortune your father ever built." And Frances had turned and looked at him then, really looked, with the snow light on her face, and something had moved behind her grave, clear eyes, surprise and a wary softening and the first faint returning ghost of hope, and she had said low, "That is a kind thing to say, and I think you meant it." And Miles had said, "I did." And that had been all, but it had been everything. And he had gone up to his cold bed that night warmer than he had been in his life, certain now that the thing was mending, that time and patience and honest work would carry them the rest of the way, that by spring they would have a true marriage and the careless sentence would be a scar and not a wound. He did not reckon with December's other watcher. For Lady Marguerite Vane had not left the county after her defeat at the great dinner. She had withdrawn only to a friend's house 10 miles off, and from there she had watched Ellsmere with the tireless attention of a woman who has staked everything on a single card and cannot afford to lose it. And she had seen the thaw, and understood it, and understood too that a frontal assault had failed and would fail again, and that the young Duchess could not be beaten by any attack from outside. And so, being genuinely clever, she had studied the thing until she found its one weak place, and the weak place was this, that the Duke's love had visibly, undeniably, begun in the very season his wife's usefulness had first been proved. She gathered the timeline as a lawyer gathers evidence. She drew out old Perrott over a neighborly glass, on exactly when the home farm had first turned its profit, and exactly when the Duke had first come to the office to praise his wife, and found them the same fortnight. She noted, from the county's chatter, that his grace had been cold to his bride for 2 months and warm to her only after she saved his estate. She assembled patiently all through those golden December weeks, the materials of a single sentence, a sentence that would take the true and tender sequence of Miles's awakening and pour it into the mold of his own careless cruelty, and make his love look like a rich man's shrewd revaluation of an asset that had proved to appreciate. She did not need to forge anything. She did not need to lie. She needed only to arrange the truth cruelly at the right moment, before the right audience, in the one ear that had never quite healed. And she chose her moment with care, and it was the Ellsmere Christmas gathering, when the whole county would be assembled, and the young Duchess most open and most happy, and therefore most exposed. And she came to it smiling, with her knife wrapped in a compliment, while Miles Ellsmere, all unknowing, dressed for the happiest evening of his year, and thought that the worst of his winter was safely behind him. It was at the Ellsmere Christmas gathering, with the great house full of holly and candlelight and half the county come to admire the Duchess who had nursed the villages through the fever, that Lady Marguerite Vane drew her last and cleverest knife. And Miles, who had begun to think her beaten, did not see it coming until it had already done its work. She waited until Francis was near and Miles nearer, and a knot of the county ladies gathered round, and she said warmly, admiringly, as though bestowing the highest of compliments, "Do you know, Duchess, I have been thinking what a very fortunate marriage this has turned out to be, for us all, I mean, for we do so love a happy ending. When you first came, one heard such doubts, the mismatch, the difference in the families. One feared the Duke would never truly value a wife so unlike himself. And now look. He is quite devoted. One sees it in his every glance. And do you know what I find so charming about it? The timing." She smiled sweetly and let the word settle. "For it was just when your cleverness with the accounts began to show, just when dear Parrot began telling everyone in the county that her Grace had turned the estate about and made it pay at last, that the Duke discovered his heart. Was it not? The very same season. I think it perfectly delightful. A man of sense, you see, learns to value what proves valuable. He married a fortune and found he had got a manager into the bargain, one who mends what she costs. Why, it is the soundest investment an impoverished Duke ever made, and no wonder he has grown so fond of it. You must be very proud, my dear, to have proved yourself so profitable. There is no securer footing in a marriage than to be useful. I always say so." And she pressed Francis's hand, and turned away in a rustle of silk, leaving the poison exactly where she had placed it, in the one wound she knew had never fully closed. Miles saw it land. He was 3 feet away. He saw his wife's face, which had been open and warm all the bright evening, go still, not white, not stricken, worse than that. Thoughtful, as a person is thoughtful who has just been handed the missing piece of a puzzle they had been trying not to solve. And he understood, a beat too late, exactly what Marguerite had done, and exactly why it was so deadly, and exactly why he could not simply laugh it off, because it was not quite a lie. That was the horror of it. His attentions had begun after the ledger. He had first sought Francis out, first felt the ground of his contempt shift, first begun to see her, in the very hour Parrot showed him the black figure she had made. Marguerite had taken the true sequence of his awakening and poured it into the mold of the original wound, and it fit, God help him. It fit as neatly as his own words had once fit, a bill of exchange, a dowry banked. And there was no way to prove that a man who fell in love with his wife the same season he discovered her worth had not simply fallen in love with her worth. He tried that night when the guests had gone. He came to her and he said, "Francis, what Marguerite said, you must not believe it. My regard for you has nothing to do with the accounts, nothing." And Francis looked at him, and she was not cold and she was not angry. She was, far worse, gently, hopelessly reasonable. "But it does, Miles," she said, and it was the first time in weeks she had used his name, and she used it now with a terrible, sad tenderness. "That is the thing I cannot argue myself past, however I try, and I have tried all evening because I did not want it to be true. But it is only sensible to be honest, and I have always valued honesty above almost everything. You did not begin to see me until I proved I could pay. When I was only a dowry, only the money, you called me a bill of exchange to your friends and set my roses aside. And then I made the estate turn a profit, and you came to the office, and you began to court me. What am I to conclude? That you fell in love with my soul in the same fortnight you discovered my soul was profitable. I would have to be a great fool to believe that, and you told the world yourself once that I was no fool, only a signature." She drew a slow breath. "I do not even blame you. It is a sound bargain. Lady Marguerite is quite right. There is no securer footing in a marriage than to be useful, and I have made myself useful, and you value me for it, and it is more than many wives get. But it is not, Miles, it is not the thing I hoped for once when I brought you a rose. And I find I am too proud still to spend my life being valued the way one values a good investment. I would rather be poor and loved than rich and useful. My father taught me the worth of money, but my mother, God rest her, taught me the worth of that, and I have not forgotten it even here." And there was nothing he could say, because everything he could say sounded exactly like what a man would say who valued a profitable investment and did not wish to lose it. His pride had built the trap, months ago, with 11 careless words, and it had sprung shut at last, and he was inside it, and he could not think how to get out. It was into this dark hour that Nicholas Ashworth came, and he came cruelly, as the very embodiment of everything Miles had failed to be. Ashworth was Josiah Hartley's junior partner, a self-made man of 35, grave and steady and quietly prosperous, and he had known Frances since she was a girl, and he had, Miles understood within an hour of the man's arrival, loved her honestly and hopelessly for years, had loved her when she was only the millowner's clever daughter with no coronet in sight, had valued her for exactly the mind and the courage and the kindness that Miles had been too proud to see, and had never spoken because he was too honorable to press a suit on a girl whose father dreamed of titles for her. He came now, ostensibly, on the business of the mills, with papers for Josiah, who was still at Ellsmere. But he came, Miles saw with a cold sinking of the heart, as a door standing open, a life of genuine, disinterested, long-proven regard, offered by a good man who had wanted Frances when she was worth nothing, in contrast to a proud duke who had only wanted her when she proved she could pay. And Josiah Hartley, watching his unhappy daughter with his shrewd gray eyes, saw the whole shape of it, and did a thing that Miles could not blame him for and would never forget. He took Frances aside, father and daughter, in the library, and Miles, passing, heard through the half-open door the old man's blunt, kind voice. "I bought you a title, lass, because you asked me to, and I've never regretted giving you anything you wanted in your life. But I'll not have you unhappy for the sake of a bargain I made. You're not a bill of exchange, whatever any fine gentleman calls you, and you'll not be treated as one while I've breath. Ashworth's a good man. He's wanted you these 5 years and never said a word out of respect, which is more than your duke can claim. If you want to come home, Fanny, if you want to be done with coronets and go back north and marry a man who valued you before you were worth valuing, I'll make it right. A separation's no scandal these days for folk with money enough, and I've money enough for anything. You've done your duty here, you've saved the man's estate, no one can say you didn't. But your duty to yourself comes into it too, and don't you forget it. So, say the word and we go home, and you needn't be a useful investment to any proud lord for the rest of your days. Say the word, lass, and it's done." And Miles Ellsmere stood frozen in the cold corridor outside the library, and did not breathe, and waited through the longest silence of his life to hear his wife's answer. "I do not know, father," Frances said at last, very low, and her voice was thick. "I do not know. I thought these last weeks, the fever, the way he stood up for you at the dinner, I thought perhaps I had been wrong, that perhaps he had truly come to, but then Lady Marguerite showed me the timing of it, and I cannot unsee it, and I am so tired of hoping and being made a fool of. When I married him, I hoped he might come to love me. When I heard him call me a dowry, I stopped hoping, and it near killed me, and I built myself up again out of nothing, the way you built the mill brick by brick, so that I need never depend on his heart for my happiness. And now he wants to knock it all down again and have me hope a second time. And if I hope again and I am wrong again, father, I do not think I could build myself up a third time. I do not think there would be enough of me left. So perhaps it is safer to go." "Perhaps it is." A long pause. "Give me until 12th night, let me be sure, and if I am not sure by 12th night, then yes, then we go home." Miles walked away down the cold corridor before he could hear more, and went out, hatless, into the frozen December garden, and stood among the bare black rose beds where, months ago, his wife had cut a rose to bring to his coat, and he understood that he had until 12th night to undo the work of a single careless sentence, and that he had not the faintest idea how, and that everything he had tried had only made it worse, and that the one thing that might save him, which was to prove that he loved her for herself and not her usefulness, was the one thing that could not be proved by any argument, but only, if at all, by some act so costly to his pride that no calculating man would ever pay it. And Miles Ellsmere, the proudest man in 3 counties, stood alone in the killing cold and began, at last, to think, not about how to keep his wife, but about what he would be willing to lose to deserve her. The days between the library door and 12th night were the strangest of Miles Ellsmere's life, for the whole great house seemed to know, though no one had been told, that its mistress was preparing to leave it, and it grieved. He saw the grief everywhere once he had eyes to see it. He saw it in old Hodges the butler, who went about his duties with a face like a closed grave and twice, catching sight of the Duchess, looked after her with a naked sorrow he was too well trained to speak. He saw it in the maids, who had grown to adore her, and who whispered in corners and fell silent when Miles passed. He saw it most of all in the tenants, for the word had somehow gone down to the villages that the Duchess who had carried the broth through the fever nights and sat up with their dying children might be going away north to her father. And Miles rode out one gray afternoon and found, at 3 separate cottages, small anxious deputations of the people his wife had saved, come to ask him, twisting their caps, whether it was true, whether her grace was leaving them. At the last cottage the laborer whose small daughter Frances had pulled back from the fever stood in his doorway and said, low and awkward, "We'd not like to lose her, your grace. Begging the liberty. She's the best thing come to this estate in my lifetime or my father's. Whatever's amiss between great folk, we'd take it kindly if you'd mend it, that's all. We'd take it kindly." And Miles rode home in the failing light with his throat tight, understanding that he was not the only one who stood to lose her, that she had planted herself in the whole life of this place in a single season, and that if she went she would leave a wound in Ellsmere that no dowry and no ledger could ever fill. He watched Nicholas Ashworth in those days with a torment that was half jealousy and half, to his own surprise, a reluctant respect. For Ashworth was everything Miles had failed to be and bore it well. He did not press his suit. He did not gloat. He was grave and courteous and kept his distance, and only in the way his eyes followed Frances across a room, steady and patient and full of a long-schooled hopeless tenderness, did Miles read the whole history of a good man who had loved a woman for years without a coronet to tempt her and had never once spoken because it would not have been honorable. And Miles understood, watching him, the cruelest truth of his situation, that if Frances chose Ashworth she would not be choosing wrongly. She would be choosing a man who had valued her when she was worth nothing, over a man who had valued her only when she proved she could pay. There was a terrible justice in it. And there were nights in that dark stretch, when Miles Ellsmere lay awake and thought that the noblest thing he could do, the one truly unselfish act left to him, was to stand aside, to let her go to the man who had loved her longer and better, and swallow his own ruin as the just price of his own folly, and not fight for her at all. But he could not do it, and in wrestling with why he could not, he came at last to the bottom of himself and found there the thing he had been circling for weeks. It was not merely that he could not bear to lose her, though he could not. It was that he had come to understand in the losing exactly what she was, not a dowry, not a manager, not a useful investment that mended what it cost, but a whole living soul of a rarity he had never met and would never meet again, a woman of a courage and a mind and a plain fierce goodness that put his 4 centuries to shame. And that a man who had been given the great fortune of such a woman's love and had thrown it in the mud with 11 careless words, had one duty left in the world above every other. It was not to stand nobly aside. Standing aside was the easier thing. It would let him keep his pride to the last, wrapped in the flattering guise of sacrifice. His duty was the harder thing, to fight humbly at any cost, past all pride, to become, if he possibly could, the man she had deserved from the beginning. Fighting for her meant giving the pride up entirely in public where it would be seen, and that, he understood now, was precisely why he must do it. There was no honor in a surrender that cost him only a woman he had wronged. There was only the hard road, the road that cost him himself. He turned it over and over through the long sleepless nights, and slowly the shape of a plan hardened in him. A thing so costly, so contrary to every instinct 4 centuries of Ellsmere's had bred into his blood, that a part of him recoiled from it even as the rest of him knew it was the only thing. His aunt had told him to find the one act no calculating man would ever perform, the act that cost him the very thing a calculating man protects, and to perform it in the open, where the world could hold him to it. Old Josiah had told him that folk believe only what costs the teller, and that he must pay in the one coin she knew he valued above her. And Frances herself, all unknowing, had told him the rest, that words the night before a decision were the cheapest words there were, and that if he had something true to say he must say it where it cost him, where the world could hold him to it. 3 counsels from 3 people who loved her or had wronged her, and they all pointed to the same terrible door. And Miles Ellsmere stood before that door through 3 long nights, and knew what lay on the other side of it, and knew what it would cost him to walk through, and found, at the bottom of his cold, proud, exhausted heart, that he was willing at last to pay the whole of it. But willingness was not yet a plan, and there were things to be done first: a viper to be drawn from the house, a truth to be uncovered, arrangements to be made in secret with lawyers and with the 1 or 2 souls he could trust, and Miles Ellsmere was not a man to move without laying his ground. So on the morning after the 3rd sleepless night, having at last stopped wondering whether he was brave enough and begun instead to reckon how the thing might actually be done, he rose and dressed and went to seek the counsel of the only people in the world who might help him do it. And the first of them, because she was nearest and shrewdest and loved him despite everything, was his aunt. He went first to his aunt because he had nowhere else to go, and the Dowager Marchioness of Wexley heard him out in the library with her spectacles low on her nose and her mouth set grim. And when he had finished the rose, the conservatory, the 11 words, the ledger, the fever, Marguerite's knife, the library door, 12th night, she was silent a long while, and then she said, "Well, Miles, you have made the most thorough ruin of the best thing that ever happened to you that I have witnessed in 80 years of watching men ruin things, and I congratulate you on a difficult achievement. Now stop feeling sorry for yourself, which helps nobody, and let us think which may. You cannot argue her out of it. You are right about that. Every word of love you speak sounds like a man protecting an investment, because you had the singular folly to fall in love with your wife in the same fortnight you learned she was rich in more than money, and there is no untangling the two by talking." She tapped her stick. "So you will not talk, you will do. You will find the one act that no calculating man would ever perform, the act that costs you the very thing a calculating man is trying to protect, and you will perform it in the open, where she and everyone can see, and you will let the act say what your words cannot. That is the only currency she will trust now, for it is the only currency that cannot be counterfeited. What is it, Miles, that a man in your position would never, ever give up? Find that, and give it up. And then we shall see whether you have a wife or a separation." And Miles Ellsmere sat in the firelight and thought, and the answer came to him slowly, and it was terrible, and it was right, and it was the only thing. Ellsmere, the estate, the name, the 4 centuries, the thing he had married her to save, the thing every soul in the world knew he had married her to save, the thing that made her usefulness so damning, because so long as he needed her money and her management to keep Ellsmere, he could never prove he wanted her and not them. The only way to sever her usefulness from her worth, absolutely and beyond any counterfeiting, was to make himself no longer need it, to offer to give up Ellsmere itself. To go to her and say, "Keep your fortune, take it back, every farthing, settle it on yourself where I can never touch it, and I will let Ellsmere fall, let the bankers take it, let 4 centuries end with me, sooner than keep you one more day as the price of saving it. Choose freely, Frances, with nothing owed and nothing owing, because there is no longer any estate for you to be useful to. There is only me, a proud fool who has finally understood that he would rather be a landless nobody with your love than the Duke of Ellesmere with your ledgers." It was, his aunt observed dryly when he told her, either the most romantic or the most idiotic thing an Ellesmere had proposed in 400 years, and quite possibly both, and she would help him do it. But first there was Marguerite, and here Josiah Hartley proved the truest ally of all. For the old millowner, when he understood the whole of it, when Miles came to him, swallowing the last of his pride, and told him plainly what he meant to do and why. Looked at his son-in-law with a slow dawning, grudging and finally genuine respect and said, "So you'd give up the whole shooting match, name and land in 400 year, sooner than have my girl think herself a mere convenience? Well, that's more than I looked for out of any lord alive, and I'll not pretend otherwise." And then his shrewd gray eyes narrowed. "But before you throw your inheritance in the river, your grace, let's you and I attend to that vain woman, for she's the root of half this mischief, and I've a man of business who can find out anything about anybody, and I've had him looking into her these 3 weeks, for I don't like a viper in the house where my daughter sleeps." What Josiah's man had found was this: that Lady Marguerite Vane, for all her earl's blood and her fashionable widowhood, was ruined quietly, comprehensively ruined, her late viscount's estate long since eaten by her gaming debts, her creditors held off month to month by the last of her credit and the strength of her expectations, and that her expectations, entire and desperate, rested upon Miles Ellsmere. She had not come to Ellsmere to reclaim an old flame out of vanity. She had come to break his marriage and secure him because she was drowning, and he was the only spar in reach, and if she could not have him she was finished. It cast every honeyed word she had spoken in a new and pitiless light, and it gave Miles, had he wished it, the means to destroy her utterly. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not wish it. There had been enough cruelty. But he went to her once privately, and he told her quietly that he knew of the debts, the creditors, the true reason for her long campaign, and that he would say nothing of it to anyone on one condition: that she leave Ellsmere in the morning and never trouble his wife again, and take with her, as a parting gift he could ill afford and gave gladly, a sum sufficient to hold off her worst creditors and let her begin again somewhere far away. "I do not do it for love of you, Marguerite," he said, "for whatever I once imagined I felt is long dead, and you killed the last of it yourself with your knife work at my wife's expense. I do it because I have lately learned, rather late, the difference between a person and a transaction, and I find I cannot use even you as merely a thing to be broken. Take the money, go, begin again, and be, if you can manage it, a little kinder in the next life than you were in this one." And Lady Marguerite Vane, who had come to Ellsmere to take everything and was leaving with only her creditors held at bay by the charity of the man she had schemed against, looked at him a long strange moment, and something in her hard beautiful face cracked, and she said, "Lo, you have changed, Miles. She has changed you. The old Miles would have ruined me and enjoyed it. I hope," she stopped and gathered herself and said only, "I hope she keeps you," and went, and was gone before breakfast, and passed, like the coldest part of the winter, out of the story of Ellsmere. That left Twelfth Night and Francis, and the one act that could not be counterfeited. He had one bad moment before the day, one setback that nearly undid the whole. On the 5th of January, restless and afraid, he had come upon Francis alone in the gallery, and had been unable to keep from speaking, and had begun, clumsily, too soon, to hint at what he meant to do. "Francis, if there were no estate, if the money were nothing between us, if I proved—" And she had stopped him gently with a raised hand and said, "Miles, do not, please. Do not make me a grand speech and a grand gesture the night before I must decide, for I will never know then whether you meant it or whether you only performed it to keep me at the last, the way a man makes a great show over a contract he is about to lose. Words the night before a decision are the cheapest words there are. If you have something true to say to me, do not say it to me alone, where I must simply take your word. Say it, if you dare, where it costs you something, where the whole world can hold you to it, and then perhaps I will believe it is not another performance." And she had gone and left him standing in the gallery, and he had understood that she had, without knowing it, told him precisely how to do the thing his aunt and her father and his own broken pride had already half designed. Not privately, not in a whispered gesture, but publicly, before the whole assembled world, where an Ellsmere's spoken word became an Ellsmere's bond and could never after be unsaid. So he made his arrangements. He invited them all to Ellsmere for Twelfth Night, the county, the old families, the very 3 friends who had laughed with him at the breakfast table months ago and heard him call his wife a bill of exchange, and had said nothing, and had let him ruin himself. He invited Josiah Hartley and Nicholas Ashworth and his aunt the Dowager. He invited, in short, every soul who had witnessed any part of his folly and some who had witnessed the whole of it, and he told none of them, not even his aunt in the end, exactly what he meant to do, because he found he wanted no rehearsal and no counsel. He wanted only to stand up before them all with nothing prepared but the truth, and pay, in the open, in the one coin his wife would trust, the whole cost of the thing he had thrown away with 11 careless words at a laughing breakfast in the autumn. And on the morning of 12th night he did one thing more alone, that no one saw. He went out into the cold garden to the bare black rose beds where Francis had once cut a rose to bring to his coat, and he found, against all season, in the one sheltered corner by the south wall, a single late rose that the frost had somehow spared, small and pale and half-opened, clinging on into January against all reason, and he cut it with his own hand, and carried it in, and set it carefully aside. For he had understood, at last, everything, and he meant that evening to give his wife her rose back. The last hours before the guests came were the longest of Miles Ellsmere's life. He had done all that could be done. The lawyer's papers lay sealed in the library, wanting only 2 signatures to make 4 centuries a gift. Marguerite was gone from the county, her creditors quieted, her knife work at an end. The county was invited, the friends of the autumn breakfast were coming, the hall was dressed with holly and set with the Ellsmere gold. Nothing remained but the deed itself, and the deed could not be rehearsed, and so he had nothing to do with the waiting hours but bear them. His aunt found him in the library at dusk, standing at the window with the single pale rose in his hand, and she looked at him a long, shrewd moment and said, "You mean to do it tonight, then? The great foolish thing, whatever it is. You have never told me the whole, and I have not asked, for I think you are right not to rehearse it, but I know the look of a man about to leap. I wore it myself once." She came and stood beside him. "I will say only this, Miles, and then I will hold my peace and watch, which at my age is nearly all I am fit for. Your mother married your father for love and was not much loved in return, and she died of it slowly, of a coldness she was too proud to complain of, and I have never forgiven the men of this family their pride, my own brother included, for it has killed more of us than any war. You are the first of them I have seen try to unlearn it. Whatever happens in that hall tonight, whether she takes you or leaves you, you will have done a braver thing than any Ellsmere in that gallery, and I am prouder of you for the trying than I have ever been of the name. Now put the rose somewhere it will not crush, and go and dress, and be brave, and if your courage fails you at the last, think of your mother at that window, and let it fail no more." She kissed his cheek, which she had not done since he was a boy, and went out, and Miles stood a while longer in the gathering dark, and then did as she bade him. Frances he saw only once before the company came, on the great stair, and the sight of her nearly unmade all his resolve, for she was armored to the teeth. She had put on the dark green silk and her father's pearls, and she had put on with them the flawless, remote, unreachable duchess he had made of her, the mask fixed and perfect, and she came down the stair composed and beautiful and shut as a strong-box, and Miles understood, watching her, that this was the face of a woman who had all but decided to leave, who had wrapped herself in her armor precisely because she meant tomorrow to break her own heart and did not wish the world to see it break. She inclined her head to him correctly. "Your Grace, the company will be arriving directly, I have seen to everything." And Miles, his own heart hammering, made her a bow and said only, "Thank you, Frances, you have always seen to everything. Tonight, if you will permit it, I mean to see to one thing myself." And something flickered behind the mask at that, a question, a wariness, but there was no time to answer it, for the first carriage wheels were already grinding on the frozen drive, and the great doors were opening, and the longest night of Miles Ellsmere's life had begun. 12th night came down cold and clear and star-hung over Ellsmere, and the great house blazed with light from every window, and the county came in its furs and its diamonds to the last and grandest gathering of the season, not knowing that they came to witness a duke unmake and remake himself in a single hour. Frances was flawless that night, and Miles, watching her move through the crowded rooms in dark green silk with her father's pearls at her throat, understood that the flawlessness was armor, that she had put on the perfect duchess the way a soldier puts on mail, because tomorrow she meant in all likelihood to leave, and a woman about to break her own heart shows the world a smooth face. Nicholas Ashworth stood grave and steady near her father, ready, if she chose him, to offer the honest life she deserved. The three friends of the autumn breakfast were there, older, easier, remembering nothing. And Miles waited, with the cut rose hidden in an inner pocket over his heart and the papers his lawyers had drawn locked in the library, until the great supper was laid and the whole company gathered in the long candle-lit hall beneath 4 centuries of Ellsmere faces. And then he stood up at the head of his own table and asked, in the cool carrying voice of his line, for the silence of his guests. "I will not keep you long from your supper," he said, "but I have a thing to say tonight that must be said before witnesses, for reasons that will grow plain, and I would rather say it to the whole of my world at once than to any part of it in a corner. Some of you here tonight were present in the autumn at a certain breakfast in this house." His eyes found the 3 friends, who looked up, puzzled. "You will not remember it. There is no reason you should." "But I remember it, for at that breakfast I said a thing about my wife that I have come to regard as the most shameful sentence of my life. I told you, laughing, that she was merely a dowry to me. A bill of exchange, I said, a pretty signature. I married her purse, I told you, and not the girl, and I felt the transaction no more than the sale of a horse." A stir went through the hall. Frances had gone very still at the foot of the table, and the color had drained from her face, for she had never known that he knew she had heard, and to hear the words spoken aloud deliberately before them all was a thing she had not braced for. Miles saw her go white and made himself go on, for this was the price and he meant to pay the whole of it. "I did not know, when I said it, that my wife stood in the doorway behind me with a rose in her hand that she had cut to bring to my coat. She heard every word. And she never told me, out of a pride finer than any I was born to, and she went on from that morning to run my house better than it has been run in a century, and to save this estate, this ancient, celebrated 400-year estate that my own family beggared through idleness, to save it with her own mind and her own 2 hands quietly, asking no credit, while I remained too proud and too blind to understand that I had thrown away, with one careless sentence, the finest thing that ever entered my life." He drew a breath. "I have spent the autumn and the winter trying to win her back with words, and I have failed, and I have deserved to fail because words are cheap, and a man who suddenly loves a wife the same season he discovers her fortune has grown profitable can prove nothing by any speech, however pretty. My wife told me so herself. She said that if I had something true to say to her, I should say it where it cost me something, where the world could hold me to it. So I am saying it here." He turned then and took from the sideboard behind him the packet of legal papers his lawyers had drawn, and held them up. "These papers," he said, "which are witnessed and sealed and require only my wife's hand and mine to make them law, do 2 things. The first is that they settle the whole of the fortune my wife brought to this marriage, every farthing of it, irrevocably upon herself, in her own sole name, beyond my reach or any husband's reach forever, so that it is hers, entirely hers, to keep or to carry away as she pleases, whatever she may decide about me. And the second," and here a low sound went through the hall, for the county understood estates and could read what was coming, "the second is that I renounce, from this night, any claim upon that fortune for the saving of Ellsmere. I would rather lose Ellsmere. I would rather see this house and this name and these 4 centuries fall, and be the last Duke of Ellsmere, and end my days a landless man, than keep my wife 1 hour longer as the price of a mortgage. There. It is done, or as good as done. It wants only the signing. From this moment my wife owes Ellsmere nothing. She is useful to nothing of mine. There is no estate for her to save, no bargain for her to honor, no investment for a calculating man to protect. There is only me, a proud fool, stripped now of the very thing that made his love suspect, asking her before all of you, with nothing left to offer but himself, whether she can find it in her to forgive the worst sentence he ever spoke. And stay, not because she is bound, not because she is useful, but because God knows I have no right to hope it, because she might, in spite of everything, Love me half as much as I have come, too late and past all deserving to love her. And into the ringing silence of that hall, before the whole assembled county, the Duke of Ellesmere came down from the head of his table, and crossed the whole long length of it to where his wife stood white and trembling at the foot. And he took from over his heart the single pale rose he had cut that morning against all season from the frozen garden, the rose the frost had spared, and he held it out to her in his open hand exactly as she had once held out a rose to him, and he said, "Lo now." For her alone, though all the hall strained to hear it, "You brought me a rose once, and I did not deserve it, and I never knew. I have brought you one back. It is the last rose in the garden, Francis. It has no business being alive in January. It has clung on through the whole killing frost against every reason, because some things, it seems, will not die however cold the season, however long the winter, however great the fool who neglected them. I am the fool. This is your rose. I am asking you to keep it. I am asking you to keep me. And whatever you answer, the papers are yours, and the fortune is yours, and you are free as no wife in England is free. And that is my gift to you either way, so that you will know, whatever you choose, that I chose you when I had nothing to gain and everything to lose, which is the only way I know left to prove that I never, after the first blind folly, wanted anything of you but this." Frances Ellesmere looked at the rose in her husband's hand, and looked at the man who had stood up before the whole of his world and given away 4 centuries to prove a thing he could prove no other way. And the flawless armor she had worn all evening cracked at last, cracked clean through, and the girl who had once cut a rose in hope stood in it again, and her eyes filled and spilled, and she did not care who saw. "You gave up Ellesmere," she said unsteadily. "You truly gave up Ellesmere for me." "I would give it up 10 times," Miles said. "It is only stone and a name. I did not understand until I nearly lost you that I had married the only thing in my life worth keeping and mistaken it for the thing worth least. Keep the rose, Francis, or do not, and go north with your father and be loved by a better man, and I will not blame you, and I will let Ellesmere fall and think the trade a fair one for having once been married to you. But I had to stand up and say it where it cost me, so that you would know, so that you would never again wonder whether you were a bill of exchange. You are not, and never were, and I would burn the whole ledger of my inheritance to unsay that I ever called you one." And Frances Ellesmere reached out before them all and took the rose from her husband's hand, and then, still holding it, she put her other hand to his face, to the proud high-bred face that had gone humble at last, and she said, so that the whole hall heard it and carried the tale through 3 counties for a generation, "Then keep your Ellesmere, Miles. Keep your name and your 4 centuries and your stone. I did not marry you for them, and I'll not have you throw them in the river for me. My father built one fortune from nothing, and I'll not watch a good man unbuild one out of penance. We will save the wretched place together, you and I, because that is what I do, and because I find I have grown fond of it, and of its tenants and its cheeses and its cold north wind, and of its duke, God help me, who is a proud, blind, impossible fool, and who has just done the one thing in all the world that could make me believe him." She was weeping and laughing at once now, and so, to the astonishment of the county, was the terrifying dowager Marchioness by the fire, and so was blunt old Josiah Hartley openly into his handkerchief. "I heard you call me a dowry," Francis said, "and it near killed me, and I built myself a wall so it could never kill me again. And tonight you have walked up to that wall and laid 400 years at the foot of it, and there is no wall in the world that stands against a thing like that. So yes. Yes, I will keep the rose. And yes, I will keep you. And you will spend the rest of your life, Miles Ellesmere, learning the difference between a wife who is useful and a wife who is loved, and I will spend mine making very sure you never confuse the two again." And the Duke of Ellesmere took his wife in his arms before the whole assembled county, under the 4 centuries of Ellesmere faces that had never in all their pride seen one of their line do anything half so wise, and held her as though he had found the one thing he had spent his whole life failing to know he wanted. And the hall broke into a great glad noise, and Nicholas Ashworth, watching, bowed his head once, and let the door of his long hope close quietly, and was, being the good man he was, glad for her. And Josiah Hartley clapped the son-in-law he had bought a title from upon the shoulder with a grip like a smith's and said, thick, Well, lad, well, you'll do after all, you'll do. They signed the papers after all in the end, but not the second one. Only the first, that settled her fortune upon herself, for Frances would have it so, that she should stay a free woman who could leave any day and chose every day not to. And they saved Ellsmere together over the long years that followed, exactly as she had said they would, until the black figures in the ledgers ran to pages, and the tenants prospered, and the west wing was roofed anew, and the oldest name in England stood secure at last upon the newest and soundest of foundations, which was a marriage of two people who had learned, the hard way, the difference between what a thing is worth and what it costs. And every winter, on Twelfth Night, the Duke of Ellesmere went out into the frozen garden to the sheltered corner by the south wall, and if the frost had spared a late rose there, he cut it and brought it in to his wife, and if it had not, he told her so gravely, and she laughed at him, and it was the same thing. For they both of them knew by then that the rose had never been the point, that the point was a man who had once set a rose aside and had spent the rest of his life learning to pick it up, and Frances Ellesmere, born Frances Hartley, the merchant's daughter who had been called a bill of exchange in a doorway on an autumn morning, lived out her long life as the most cherished woman in 3 counties, not merely a dowry and never again a mistake, but chosen, freely and openly, and past all counterfeiting, by the proud man who had wounded her, and had unlearned his whole inheritance of pride to win her back.